Welcome to DBA Fundamentals presentation for today, April 8th, 2025, on practical insights on SQL Server consolidation and migration. Our speaker today is Andreas Wolter, so we should go right ahead and begin with the greatness. In the top right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see the three leaders of the DBA Fundamentals group: Steve Cantrell, Shane O'Neill, and myself, Kevin Wilkie. To the right of our names is the X username for ourselves if you need to get a hold of us for any reason. Below that are the many ways of social media you can get to us. First off is Meetup, where most of you probably got today's information. We like to go through Meetup because that seems to be Microsoft's preferred way to get information out there, and we like Microsoft. I mean, we like Meetup as well. Below that is our webpage for DBA Fundamentals, dbafund.com. It has all of our past presentations, all of our future presentations, everything we got linked up, ready to go for y'all. And below that, is our YouTube page, dbafundtube.com, where you can like and subscribe to see every time we put out a new presentation on the web. You can see all of our past presentations as well. As I said, be sure to like and subscribe to make sure you can see every presentation we put out there as quickly as it comes available. Speaking of, we'll have this presentation available within 3 to 5 business days usually. We try to get it to you pretty quick. Below the dbafundtube.com is our various other ways to get hold of us on X, Slack, and on LinkedIn. Pretty soon is our upcoming conferences. On May 7th and 8th is the Data Innovation Summit. It's a hybrid one, so you don't have to worry about going anywhere if you feel like. You can actually just go to Data Innovations Summit and find out all about it there. Plus, in June, there's a Databricks one for data and AI. It's a summit as well, so it's be great fun. I think that one's in San Francisco as well, so if you're anywhere near San Francisco, this sounds like a great one for great fun and enjoyment, as well as lots of learning. Please remember to turn off your video and mute yourself so we can all pay attention to Andreas. I'll even turn off my sound here in just a minute. And please be sure to type any questions you have into the chat, and we'll be sure to follow up with Andreas as we go through. And with that, speaking of Andreas, my friend, over to you.
All right, thank you. Let me put my screen on here.
I see the screen.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, hello everyone. Glad for you to make it here. I know it's probably middle of the workday for many of you. Don't know the time zones. It's a big crowd, so I have no idea where you guys are joining from, but I suppose from across the states at the very least. So that's great to see the interest. And I suppose one of the terms here is cost optimization, so which seems to be a thing lately. Let's save some money. So let's hope that session will help you on this journey and get you some ideas on how to approach this in terms of SQL Server. All right, I'm going to turn back off my video just to save some bandwidth, but just so you believe me, I'm real, I'm not a chatbot. Actually, I'm going to hand over to my AI assistant starting now. All right. Cool. So yeah, just a brief word about me. I've been in the business with SQL Server pretty much for 25 years. Very easy to remember since I started in the year 2000 with pretty much version 2000, actually 7.0 back then, but who cares? So old. Although sometimes I do see one in a company. I don't know who has the oldest SQL Server version here in the room. Any takers? Anybody still on 7.0 something here in production? Then please put it in the chat. I once had a conference, there was actually somebody who still had SQL Server 6.0 something. That was really insane. Yeah, so I'm more focused on security and performance and HA than all the other stuff left and right. I try to focus on big and fast and what really matters, secure. All right. I've been with Microsoft for the last couple of years. For 5 years, I was a program manager for Azure SQL and SQL Server security. I decided to leave and go back to consulting. I found my company Sapedon Quality Lab in the US here, the same name as I used to have back in Germany. So yeah, excuse my accent. I'm actually German, so English is my second language. Yeah, you can find me in the web on these several links that I put here in the slide. Okay, so let's get to the content. So what we're going to talk about is briefly what are our goals with consolidating or migrating, then the typical phases that you will go through, and then how can you do that? What are some techniques that you can utilize, and then a short review. That's pretty much the rough flow of the things. So what are your goals when you are consolidating / migrating? And sometimes use these terms interchanging because they're very closely connected. If you consolidate SQL Server, if you have a big enterprise with many SQL servers and you want to consolidate them onto a few lesser amount of SQL Server installations, in the end, you will usually have some migration because not all of them will have the same version already, probably, right? So migration is very closely connected to this overall story. So one of the goals, of course, is going to be cost, right? You can save cost by saving licenses, by basically just lowering the amount of licenses required, which is very much interconnected to the hardware, because if you use less servers, you're probably going to have less hardware. So you're going to have less hardware cost, and you will have less CPUs to license, right? Licenses are usually bound to CPUs or servers. So that's the first angle that you have, right? Less hardware, less licenses, that will save you cost. Another aspect will be operational cost. So consolidation, remember, means you come from many and you will have less SQL Server installations. That will make it easier for you to maintain them, to keep them updated. All the maintenance work around the operational cost basically will be lower. Right? That's another aspect. Cloud is always a topic, and I do think I should point it out, right? Since many people think, oh, I moved to the cloud and it's managed by Microsoft. Yeah, that is true to an extent, but there is still a lot to do. And from what I've seen, purely by moving to the cloud, like you can obviously consolidate and move to the cloud in one step. Going to the cloud, the operational costs are not the piece that you're going to save the most, right? That's much less than people expect. In fact, sometimes even reverse, right? Because there's so much architectural rethinking required. So don't focus on that one. If you want to save money, it's really more about the overall hardware and licensing cost. Yeah, other aspects are to increase capacity. Now that sounds a little bit like the opposing factor. But I think we will solve this this dilemma within this session here. Basically, if you consolidate onto a lesser number of SQL servers, those SQL Server installations tend to be bigger, right? Because you're gonna move database onto them, and you can utilize the bigger hardware that you have on the new installation. In a better way, basically. So you have more capacity for your existing workload, even though they are going to be co-hosted on the same, right? So they may come from a smaller server. Now they get to be on a bigger server, which they are sharing. But in real life, typically, all these workloads don't run on the exact same time. So there is a lot of potential that with less servers, you basically can use less hardware, but consolidate on a big server and still have the ability to utilize, if you really required more CPUs than you had on your former system. Right? We will get in that in some more examples here. Yeah, standardization is another aspect. If you standardize your SQL Server versions, your life will be easier, right? You don't have to care about so many different versions of CUs where you need to patch, etc. Right? Consolidating server is one version, right? Depends how many you will, or on how many you consolidate. But the less, the better for you, right? The more homogeneous your installation or environment will be, the easier your life will be, and that comes back to the operational cost as well, right? Centralized versus decentralization is more like a philosophy, right? But the goal of consolidation is obviously to centralize your resources onto one bigger box or a few bigger boxes versus having hundreds of smaller boxes all around, right? Which will help you simplify maintenance. So typically you set up maintenance at the server level, which will take a look at all databases that are hosted on the server. For example, CheckDB, which you all do, right? So you set it up once at the server level, right? No matter how many databases there are, right? This month you may have 1,000 databases. Next month it will be 1,200 databases. But the maintenance usually just set up once, right? And it will go through the list of currently available databases and maintain them, right? Versus if you have many installations, you need to keep track that you really make sure that is the maintenance set up on this new server here? Is it there? Like as soon as you get a new application with new databases on a new server, you need to go through this whole cycle, right? Versus on a centralized system where everything is already in place. Right? So that again goes back to operational cost, right? Performance comes to the point system capacity, right? Now you can utilize a bigger server if you need it. Like on peak times, your application can now utilize much more hardware, but which typically it really only needs at certain times, right? Not the whole time, not constantly. So that's the advantage if you have a bigger system. And in fact, this is a little bit the way that you can handle it in the cloud as well, right? In the cloud, you sometimes want to just pay by what you actually require because things are co-hosted in Azure, right? And that's a little bit the same approach, except that you host it yourself, right, on your own bigger installation here. All right, yeah. Scalability is another aspect. You want to make sure that your system can scale over the next X years, all right? So you prepare for that on one system or a few systems, and it's easier to do than having to say like, oh, every time I got a new application, I have to set up a new server and assign resources, etc. This is not very easy to plan. It's better to have that on a fewer larger boxes. Yeah, and when you have it consolidated, you can also much easier ensure your HA, right? If you have a bigger server and bigger installation, it's a one-time configuration almost. Like you decide how much availability you want to give these databases that are hosted on this server. You can form multiple availability groups with different SLAs. But you don't have to do it on many servers or as many servers as you had before, right? So that in the end will help you to actually get through it and optimize your HA configuration. All right, yeah, this is my sketch screen. So I've used the term consolidation quite a few times, and just to make sure we are on the same page here, let me just briefly draw it, what consolidation in rough term means, right? So current environment, and excuse me, I'm really not a good artist. These are supposed to be servers, right? All of them are SQL servers. All right, and you have a bunch of them. That's your existing environment. Consolidation means basically take these and move them on one or maybe a few, but definitely less than you had before, larger boxes. And you will have reasons to decide that you need more than one, and we will get to that. It will be typically security reasons, right? But in the end, you end up with less servers than you had before, right? That's the whole point of the consolidation. So obviously, if you have a little bit different variations here in SQL Server versions on your current environment, here you can only have one version or maybe two if you have two installations here, right? But you will end up consolidating or making it easier, or sorry, evening out the SQL Server version spread that you had before, right? So if you have SQL Server 2019 and 2022 mixed before, you will probably have just 2022. And maybe there's one or two applications that you can really not upgrade to a newer version, but then those will have the extra server that you may have to set up here, right? So that's it in a nutshell. All right, so how do we get there? One of the first questions I usually get actually is about the licensing. So how am I actually gonna save money in licensing? And I'm just gonna have 2 slides on that. It's not a licensing session, right? You can easily spend a whole hour on just licensing on all the different variations and possibility, but just to get on the same page, to give you the idea, right? How that can save you money, right? Just looking at what we have right now, right? We have Enterprise and Standard Edition. Of course, then we also have these free editions, Developer and Express. Enterprise is licensed per core, actually per double core, right? And Standard Edition can also be licensed with server plus client access license, right? Prices are as follows. Enterprise Edition is about 15K for this double core pack, and the Standard Edition is about 4K for double core pack, right? Obviously cheaper, right? So when you consolidate, you usually will consolidate into an Enterprise Edition, right? So the question is, how will you actually get cheaper if you are consolidating multiple Standard Editions to an Enterprise Edition, right? So I will have an example of that. Often you're also encountering the question, what is production, right? And that comes up a lot, right? You may be aware that for a non-production, you can actually just use a test or a developer edition, right? So the question is, what is production, right? So one of the things you can eliminate in this whole process of evaluating how much you can save is make sure that you really just license what is true production, right? So if you have a server that you just use for running DBCC or for tests, right, that is not production, right? So have a look at the official licensing guides to make sure that you fall in this area. But there is quite a potential to save money there in this area if you make sure that you qualify as production correctly and not just unnecessarily. Same for passive SQL Server replica, right? They usually, if you have Enterprise Edition, you do not need to license if it's truly passive, right? If you use the software assurance subscription, that will even give you some more included failover licenses basically for disaster recovery, which you can see in this table here. So that's another aspect. Of course, it comes as a price, right? It's about like 35% on top, you can say, of these costs that you already have for the license, but it's a subscription. I think it's 3 years that it is written off. When it comes to consolidating, one of the typical ways that you will do it is probably gonna be like you're gonna have a bigger box in the end. And let's make it simple here. We're just gonna license the whole physical, the physical server underneath. So if you have a big VM host, there's 12 physical cores, right? You can license them all. And then it doesn't matter how many VMs you actually run on this host. And there may be reasons that you need more than one SQL Server, right? Maybe some applications that cannot be upgraded, or for security reasons. But licensing wise, it shouldn't bother you if you have 1 or 2 more VMs than you actually intended to, right? Since you have licensed the whole host already, right? So that's one way, and which is quite common in these projects, that you just go for the whole host, dedicated for SQL Server, license all cores, and then you can put as many VMs with SQL Server as you like. All right, so based on the numbers that we have just seen, I've made an example calculation here. It's not an exact client project, but I have seen multiple projects, and this is quite realistic an approach. I mean, I have seen much bigger numbers, but I don't know your environment, so I kept it like medium size. So let's say your current environment has in sum about 74 servers, right? Most of them start edition, 60 start editions, and which have 4 cores, so fairly small environments. A few more with 8 cores, but you will always find a bunch of enterprise edition installations as well. So we have a couple here with different sizes, 12 core, one with 12 core, 3 with 8 core, and 4 with 4 core. Since you only need to license the double pack, of course, so the calculation is basically, let's look at the last one here. So one server with 12 licenses, with 12 cores, you only need to license 6, right? So in the end, your current cost will be around $1 million, just in licensing cost for this installation, right? So that's quite a realistic scenario. And if you're able to consolidate that onto one large enterprise cluster, enterprise SQL Server installation with 48 cores, right? License 24 of them, and then maybe you need a couple of others for standard edition, 5 more with each 8 cores, right? You end up with less than $500,000, right? So in this case, you have you can save $500,000 US dollars just by consolidating, right? And this is a realistic scenario, right? It's not an exact copy of a client, but given what I have seen and what I've worked on, this is quite realistic. In fact, I have seen much larger numbers. I mean, the larger the installation is before, typically the more savings you can have, right? We're talking about millions then, not just $500,000. So I see one question here. In the case of SQL Server licensing with user device cards, does the virtual machine have to be, is it possibly cheaper? Okay, so that goes in the details here of the licensing piece. I'm not exactly 100% sure. I do not think you need to also license the host, since you're already licensing the server and the CAL for the start edition. I don't think you need to additionally license the host. Wouldn't make sense to me. Is it possibly cheaper to license per core? That's just a calculation, right? Depends how many client access licenses you need. How many clients do you need? You make the calculation, right? The client access license 230. Add that to the server license that you have, and then compare this with depending on how many cores you need, right? Multiply that, and then you will have your answer, right? It could be cheaper, could also not be. I can't tell you. Are all logins in AD counted as potential users? I believe but I'm not 100% sure. Again, it would require really always talk with your licensing expert. You will probably not find a single SQL Server consultant who will just give you an answer and say, this is that. It's just too risky, right? In the end, it depends on or the person that you're talking with, who you are making the deal with. The way he interprets the law, can almost put it this way, and I'm not a lawyer. I don't think it's related to AD. It is related to what is typically actually logging on to your server, like potential user accounts on your SQL server, right? That's the way I understand. But make sure with a licensing expert, and I am not one. Definitely not. I'm not the certified licensing expert. Yeah, but good question. All right. So now we have some motivation, I hope. So what are the typical stages in this consolidation project, right? First one will be like, which SQL Server installations do we even have? How many? Which version, right? How big are they, right? All those things you want to know, right? Then you catalog your environment like in detail, right? You will assess the SQL Server installation. We have more details about that we go down to database level, right? You want to understand like what are the specific features that are installed or utilized on SQL Server, security settings, specifically HA. Is there replication running? Is there maybe even reporting services on the same box, right? Things like that. Databases, anything special about them? For example, TDE, right? Is anybody using TDE? You will want to know that before you consolidate. Or CLR, another thing, right? Assess performance, and this is really critical. I mean, if you remember this slide, I just basically, out of 74 servers, I think I made like 8 servers or something here in this example, 6 servers, right? I mean, you just look at the slide and think, okay, but how can you actually do that? How do you know these 48 cores of this enterprise are actually enough, right? That is critical. And you only know that if you have actually evaluated the performance of your existing environment, right? So you need to know how much you are actually utilizing, right? But typically you will find out that if you have these 100 SQL servers, that most of them will not have a constant workload and only use all the hardware maybe a few times a month, yeah, or a few times a day, but definitely not always, right? Not constantly, right? This is why you can then consolidate on one machine. You will need to understand the HA requirements of all these existing installations, right? And that gets you in the topic, do you actually have an SLA, right? Maybe that's the moment where you realize, oh, nobody officially gave you an SLA for that. Yeah, the performance requirement is related to the SLA, right? Very important security requirements, and that may be a reason to have dedicated SQL servers, right? If you have applications that absolutely insist of using sysadmin, well, sorry, that you cannot co-host with other databases, right? It's just too risky. So once you have cataloged the current environment, you will then design the new environment, right? Hardware requirements, you calculate the security requirements that you have in your target system. Make sure you account properly for dev, test, train, QA, prod, etc. Right? Again, you don't need to license dev, right? So that's why at this point you really want to cleanly separate what is truly dev or test to move it on a developer edition versus the others, and only the others go to a production environment that you actually licensed, right? So make sure that's one potential to save a lot of money here. And then you will plan your migrations. Every migration looks a bit different, so make sure to document it. And now I'm starting to use the term migration here also, right? Since we have now seen that there's potentially hundreds of SQL servers involved, and certainly there will be some editions that are older than the current one, right? Yeah, try to go for the easiest ones first, right? You want to start the project with a hooray, it works, and not, oh, the biggest mess as the first one and grind on, right? Start with something simple to prove the concept. You will definitely get to the complex migrations. Complex meaning like complexer technology requirements, like preparing as CLR, service brokers, TDE, etc. Replication, all these things will take more time than just moving a database onto a new version if it's independent from any of these specialties. All right. Okay, so that's the overall approach, right? So cataloging your environment, right? You will want to understand what are the Windows server versions, right? And this is where the real work starts, right? So I've been in multiple projects now, specifically in healthcare, but also others, where you have hundreds of applications in hospitals or medical centers, very important applications that are running for years, if not decades. And these client machines have a lot of local dependencies, right? So they are very often SQL Server installed next to the application on the same machine, right? You want to consolidate it onto a central SQL Server. You first need to find out what happens if you actually move the database away from the application server to a central SQL Server. Is there anything that the application is missing on that central server, right? Is there any dependency file level, like, for example, a table that contains pointers to a hard drive, local C drive, D drive? I've seen all of that, right? So those things you really want to know before you start moving databases around, right? Can be local DSNs where you need to configure the new destination, etc. Right. So depending on your environment, it can be very complex task alone, right? If your environment is pretty new and clean, okay, that may be easier, but practice tells the larger, the more messy, right? When it comes to SQL, obviously you want to know the versions, the patch level, if there's any HA already in use, clustering or availability groups or log shipping, any of these other services, reporting, integration, analysis services, master data services, etc. You need to account for those, right? They are covered by the same SQL Server license, but you obviously need to install them separately, and they may not end up on the same host or on the same server, hopefully, right? You probably have a dedicated VM for SSRS and SSAS, so make sure you account for that beforehand. Yeah, trace flags that may be required for applications. Some applications like really need a specific trace flag, like SharePoint, for example. The question is, can you put this trace flag on or turn it on a shared system, or is that another reason to keep it dedicated, right? That's why you need to know that now. Yeah, and database, right? The typical things you look for, compat mode, like how high can you go? How high does the software vendor allow you to turn up the compatibility mode, right? Recovery mode of databases, right? Collation, query store on or off, replication, etc., right? Everything has to do with encryption. You definitely want to double check to make sure that there are no local dependencies or dependencies on master database. How do you actually migrate those things, right? You want to be able to read the data after you migrate the database, right? File stream, auditing, etc. And last but not least, is there anything special to security, right? Are you even allowed to willy-nilly copy the database and move it to a new server? What do you need to account for? Right? Maybe you need to already encrypt the backup, make sure that the destination for the backup is properly secured and on the new server, obviously as well, right? That nobody can access the data in the midst. So when you do these migrations, make sure who has or understand where do you store these files for migrations, right? Who could potentially read the data. Yeah. All right. So, and since all of our SQL databases don't work by themselves, right? We're all depending on applications. Yeah, you definitely need to talk with the application owners. So who knows about the applications? When can you actually migrate them? Right? Especially in healthcare, when it comes to hospitals, there's often 24 hours use for certain applications, not for all of them, but for some, right? So you need to make sure that you get proper maintenance or migration windows. Understand the estimated goals since you want to consolidate onto one machine, right? Or understand the workloads. What times of the day will the database have special or peak workloads, right? Make sure to account for that. Yeah, and make sure to get sign off from the vendors. Obviously, that's for supportability reason. However, in real life, it will be tough. That's one of the most time-taking tasks to actually find the vendors of applications. Sometimes they are not even around anymore. All right, applications can be very old. At some point, you will just have to make an educated call and try it out. Right, do a test migration, obviously, always, and see how far you can move up the SQL Server version and the compatibility level. Right. Obviously, your goal is going to be as little variation in the end as possible. Right? In a perfect world, you would have everything on SQL Server 2022 as the latest compat level, but that's impossible, right? But it's just your goal, right? All right, yeah, put some tables here to give you an idea, right? All these details that you can look at SQL Server, right? What you want to understand. Lots of details you need to understand about master database, because in the end, you will, like if you have 100 SQL Server with different settings that are stored in master database, or objects that are stored in master database, like linked servers, server role definition, CLRs, configuration setting, cryptographic objects in general, all these things, right? Once you move it to a consolidated server, which of these things can you actually migrate without having conflicts, all right? So make sure to have an understanding what is coming, where's it coming from, to be co-hosted on the same machine, because you obviously end up with just one master database. Yeah, same as for MSDB. Typically more work, right? Because hopefully all your servers have jobs for maintenance, so you definitely have to look at these jobs. What is maintenance? What can you replace with your maintenance plans, right? Instead of relying on the existing maintenance plans, which may have been provided by vendors or by different other DBAs and different variations, right? You will see that these maintenance plans on the existing environment will differ a lot, right? It's very often that they are, a bit messy, right? Every server is maintained a bit differently, right? On your target server, you will hopefully get a grip on that and just have one proper setup of maintenance plans for every database, and that's it, right? But you still need to figure out what other jobs are there that you need to migrate. What is not maintenance? So the application bring its own jobs for import, export, or etc. routines that run against the database, because all of the jobs you then need to migrate. So in the end, you may need to actually even look inside the jobs to understand what's happening inside them. Make sure that you don't think that's just a maintenance plan, and actually inside the maintenance plan somebody put a custom command, and you can do that. So double check that you're not losing application processes on the way. All right. So if you have gained all this knowledge, like you understand how much resources your existing environment requires at peak times or on average, and on average, you will then be able to calculate what do you actually need on your new system, right? So find a way to calculate realistic resource usage as detailed as possible, or as close to the source as possible. So for example, VMware's counters are not close enough to the source. They will very vastly exaggerate. If you go down on the SQL level, you will see much different results than VMware could do. Like for example, VMware doesn't understand locking at all, right? And locking has a big impact on how you're actually using hardware, right? So all these things, try to go deeper, have a specialized tool that can help you to actually understand SQL Server performance and not VM level performance or host level performance. Right? At least monitor about 31 days, including the end of the month, right? Because some systems have a special workload on the end of the month. So you want to understand that peak workload to make sure that your target system accounts for that, has enough resources, right? Yeah, and all of these special security challenges that may exist, right? Okay, so given you understand your existing requirements, you design your new hardware, you put some on top, obviously, you want to make sure to not make it too tight. And then make sure that you understand which server level objects, MSDB objects, etc. You can handle in which way. So for example, here, this is the point where I want to point out contained availability groups. Maybe a quick hands up here in the chat or in the group here. Have you heard of contained availability groups as opposed to just just availability groups? Anybody ever heard of that? Maybe even using them? Hands up. Here's a small icon that you can use for hands up. Nobody ever heard of that? Should I make the opposite? Who has not heard? Okay, Lars has heard of it. Hallo Lars, wie geht's, wie steht's? All right, so anybody and used, yeah, Lars is actually using them, yeah. So contained availability groups, they are not that much used yet, and I always wonder, I don't know, some seem to have been missed somehow under the other noise, but they will save you so much work, right? So maybe as a consultant, you don't like it because you save time, right? But they really save a ton of time for your end system, right? Because if you work with availability groups, you will probably know that if you have multiple nodes and you set up the database in the AG, you need to make sure that all the logins exist on all the nodes, right? And as soon as you put a new login into an application, you need to then add it to all the other nodes as well to make sure that all the logins always exist on all the other nodes, right? So you need to maintain that, right, with some additional PowerShell scripts, etc. So this is messy. There's not really a great method if you use the standard availability groups. Same with jobs, right? The application comes, installs some jobs on the current primary. That's nice. It all works. Now you have a failover. to the secondary, and well, somebody forgot that you need to set up these jobs on the secondaries as well. And not just that, you also need to make sure that they don't just run on the secondary, that they have to wait until the secondary becomes primary, until they can actually run, right? So that's quite a head of an overhead, right? Especially when it comes to jobs. You need to create them, but you also need to make sure that they don't run on the wrong node at the wrong time, right? So lots of work. I mean, we have been doing that for the last decade with the existing availability groups, but with contained availability groups, you do not need to do that anymore. That's the amazing thing, right? You just really need to take care of the primary, put your logins in the contained AG, like you really put it in the AG, not on the server. Put the logins in the AG, put the jobs in the AG, not on the server, in the AG. And the AG basically replicates that to all its nodes, and they will wake up on the right node with all that information when they need it. Right, so you don't need to care about logins or jobs replication anymore, right? You just create them once on the current primary, and that's it, right? Ton of headache saved. And trust me, this is always going to be an issue, right? If you have availability groups, obviously we have runbooks, documentation, reminding everybody always, yeah, don't forget to create logins on the secondaries of all of them, right? Asynchronous, don't forget about the asynchronous one. And then even worse, the jobs, right? Add a little bit of code in the job to make sure it doesn't run when it's not the primary, right? I mean, manual work, right? Horrible. So yeah, definitely have a look at contained AGs. Caveats, yeah, unfortunately, there are a few caveats with contained. I mean, what do you say? Read through how they work. You need to understand the different way how they actually work. Otherwise, you may end up with a little bit surprises at some points. So it's not like they don't do their work, right? But for example, you may realize that if you have auditing set up on your server and you have contained availability groups, that the auditing doesn't affect the contained availability group activity. So let's say you have auditing set up for failed logins on your server, but now the people are actually logging on to the contained availability group, because that's like a little bit like a virtual server inside the SQL Server, maybe from that aspect. If they log on to the availability group and have a failure, that will not be logged on the server. You need to have the auditing inside the contained availability group, just like you have the login, right? So there are a few more pieces that are parts of the contained availability groups, because in essence, and that's the main thing you need to understand, in a contained availability group, the master database and the MSDB database, they are part of the AG. And with that is logical, right? Since auditing is stored in the master database, the host auditing is not the same as the contained AG auditing, right? Same as jobs, because it's stored in MSDB, same as logins, because it's stored in the master, right? If you understand that, you will have less surprises, but definitely have a look at that. It's just one-page documentation. Unfortunately, it's not very well documented. Yeah. But other than that, I'm using it in projects and I'm super relieved. I mean, there are some surprises, but in the end, the time that I'm saving is still worth it. All right. Nothing. All right. Yeah, coming to the migration, how do you actually do that, right? Your method, right? And this is now standard migration stuff, right? I mean, go for the easiest, right? Whatever is the easiest, try that first, right? Now it really depends. The way you do it depends on your SAA, on your HA requirements. How much time do they give you to migrate the databases? And database typically is belonging to an application, right? So how much time off can you take for an application, right? If you give you a couple of hours or 1 hour, you're probably gonna do it with a backup restore, right? If you have a really small window, like maximum 15 minutes, you may get away with log shipping, right? If you sub 15 minutes, and these are just rough numbers, right? I'm not gonna put them here. Don't put it in stone here, but roughly, right? If you need to go even lower, then you will start to look at database mirroring for older versions. But if you're really coming from old version, you need to start with database mirroring, like pre-2012, and or availability group failover. So in that case, you actually need to set up availability groups just to migrate the database, right? It's a huge amount of work, so that's just the last resort, right? If you really need to keep it basically online sub or only have like minutes or so for the taking the database offline, right? Then you need to trick around with failovers from version to version. Yeah, definitely do it integrity check before migration, right? If you don't want to migrate corrupt data, right? You want to integrity check it before. Do another integrity check after, but definitely do it before, right? The reason why I'm saying that is once you actually have a corruption issue, it is usually easier to fix them on an older version. Yeah, that's funny, but it is the case. I've been through that a couple of times in my life. It's easier to handle. There's more tools available for older versions than for newer versions, right? So you want to find corruption earlier. Yeah, certain settings you just fix before, right? Clean up, right? Auto close nonsense, right? Make sure our database use page verified checksum, no auto shrink, trustworthy turned off unless they really can't survive without, and that might be a reason then to put it on a dedicated instance, right? I don't want to have a database with trustworthy set on my shared instance, right? It's just too risky. Same with database chaining, right? Those things, yeah. And definitely do a test migration if you can do. Yeah, always have a fallback plan. Can be just easy, right? I mean, most fallback plans are easy. Just there will be applications that are really hard to do a fallback, but in reality, out of 100, I would say 75 are really just easy. Just say, oh, okay, we tested for half a day. If it doesn't work, we just restart in the old system, right? That may be for the majority of applications. For another part of applications, it will be more tricky. Then you actually need to figure out what if, right? I'm running on a new system and I create data and I need to migrate backwards because only now I find out something isn't working, right? Then you actually need to have a way to pull out the newly created records out of the new system to bring it back, right? And that is really a big depends on the application, how complicated that is. There's a question from Young something, yeah? You want to speak or do you want to type?
John, you can unmute if you want.
Oh, go ahead and speak. Otherwise, I will keep talking for now. Yeah. Okay, then you do a migration, block access to old system, right? To make sure that you don't end up in a split brain scenario where some users are still on the old and then the new, and some are on the old on the new system, right? That would definitely create you a headache. Right, but again, in most cases, it will not be such a big issue, right? Unless it's really valuable records that are being created, right? But the majority of uploads of like in general, right? Majority of stuff isn't that scary, right? Just reading some stuff or maybe creating one entry that they can recreate it. But you never know if it's one of those exceptions, right? So, all right. So yeah, just block the access to the old system. Keep your old system around, of course. Let users test on a new one. Agree on a time frame, right? Obviously, you're going to have a test immediately after migration, like to find whatever obviously doesn't work. But give them another week maybe to make sure that they really have found everything, that there's nothing later popping up. And at some point, you need to make a call and say, okay, so a week or two later, we will decommission the old system, right? Turn it off completely. And then another month later, maybe just delete it, right? Don't keep the stuff around forever. It's also a target for hackers, right? Okay. Techniques. So Yong 21122, if you want to speak, go ahead or just type. All right, yeah. Try to find tools that can help, right, for all of these pieces that you have talked about. So network scope, scanning for SQL Server installations, right? Some of those tools can even list the databases. So there are several tools out there. Some are from Microsoft, some are from vendors. Honestly, none of them are perfect or not even close to perfect. All of them have caveats. which is why I'm not listing them. It's just to, yeah, it's not. I mean, we could talk about them, but for every one of them, I have to tell you a caveat. You will end up using multiple of them and cross-referencing information. For example, Microsoft, what's the name, Maps tool, doesn't understand SQL Server 2022 properly, right? So you need to cross-check that with another tool. So yeah, you will end up using multiple ways to get to your final list, right? Once it's the server scope, and we're talking about this assessment, right? To understand what are the settings of the server, etc., right? Some tools can collect stuff for you, high level, yeah. Most of the stuff I'm just collecting myself. It's Management Studio queries, right? I use what's it called? Registered servers a lot, central management servers a lot for these things. You probably know what this is. I'm just putting in the screen here, right? The registered servers, which you find here under View Registered Servers, where you can register all your SQL Server installation. This is very empty. It's just a local one here, right? But you can have hundreds of SQL servers here, which you then can basically, you can run a query across all of them at once, right? Now, that's the theory. In practice, if you have a large environment and have hundreds of SQL Server in such a group, some of them will not even be running sometimes. So you obviously get errors when you do that. Another issue is if you have different SQL Server versions, the queries that you run may fail on some and work on others, right? So you need to account for that. You need to find your way how to deal with that depending on your queries. Maybe you have a folder per version, or your queries are really just bare queries that work downwards a few versions until a certain one, and then you pull the rest manually, etc. Right? You just have to account. There's not 100% foolproof way, but it still works well enough, right? Those few things that it doesn't work, it's not worth writing your old tool, I would say, right? Same for collecting database level stuff here. SPM is for each DB. Yes, I know all the issues about it, but still, in 98% of database, it just does the job, right? And the rest I can do with another way. It's not worth for me to create my own method there. That's just me. I'm lazy, right? I try to save time, and it still saves me time. So yeah, database migration method assistant is one tool that you can use and should use, an automated way that tells you about issues in databases when you want to migrate them. Definitely use that one. There's also this database experimentation assistant from Microsoft, which I would only ever consider for really large and critical system though. Otherwise, it's just an overkill, and it's not supported anymore. Yeah, that's the database migration assistant, right? You come from a SQL Server version, you tell it you want to upgrade it to version XYZ, and it tells you, basically, if you look here at the screen, it's coming from level 100, and it tells you for every level of compatibility level that you go higher, how many issues it finds, right? And which ones of them are really breaking changes. So the red piece here is a little in the middle, but this is breaking changes, like really doesn't work anymore, right? DBCC statements found that don't exist anymore, a column that doesn't exist, or whatever, right? These things you really need to fix, otherwise you just can't migrate, right? And then there are some like other pieces, right? Maybe just behavior changes or things you shouldn't do, right? But you can still migrate, right? So definitely use that one. Yeah, implementation assistant. Yeah, for really complex and for really it's not complex, but environments under high workloads where you really need to make sure that you reach a certain performance level after the fact. That's where this tool excels, but it's a beast by itself to set up. Right? I think it's like a distributed replay in the background. So it's usually not worth getting into that, but it may at some point be. It depends on your project. Yeah, gives you some nice output, a little bit like the migration assistant, etc. Not supported, but it doesn't mean it doesn't run. It still works. All right. Yeah, I think we talked enough about performance. Yeah, the techniques, stock shipping, etc. Yeah, I think we talked about that. Yeah, your target HA solution. I mean, it's a bit thing of what are you experienced with? What do you understand? If you only understand failover cluster instances and have never dealt with availability groups, it's probably not. It would be great if you can switch, but be realistic. Can you actually understand the new technology quickly enough to support it properly? I don't know. I would go for availability groups in most cases, but there are scenarios where you're still better off with failover cluster instances, right? And when it comes to availability groups, actually, I take the contained one if I can under SQL 2022. All right. Yeah, another piece about jobs, right? If you're migrating hundreds of applications with all their database and jobs running there, you will find out that many of these jobs run on the same time. So if you put them all on your same shared system, you will probably have some resource issues, right? Because as long as they were all in dedicated instances, well, they had their hourly whatever jobs, right? Every 15 minutes, maybe another job, but it will typically have peaks at the hour, right? So this is like a screenshot here from a tool that I've used, right, where it shows you 150 jobs starting at the hour, right? And then the other ones at 15, 30, 45, right? And then and so on, right? But most of them at the hour, right? So you will need to understand that, and you will definitely need to adjust these schedules, right? That's not realistic that you take that you have one server now supporting hundreds of databases with their potentially thousands of jobs running at the exact same time. That will not work, right? That's not proper consolidation, right? That's just crazy. Consolidation means you try to utilize the hardware on your target system properly. So you will need to make sure that they start at different times. So it's not a thing about beauty, right? I make sure that you have odd numbers, right? Run jobs at 0.3 or something, right? Make sure that not all of them end up at the hour or 0.5 or 0.15, etc. Right? Spread them out. That's the word. That's important. All right. Yeah, we are at the hour pretty much. So yeah, I hope you understood that there are some challenges. Obviously, you first need to account for, get a proper understanding of your environment, of your existing one. Account for compatibility issues, make sure to isolate for security reasons. That's the number one reason why you have dedicated instances, security. Yeah, always have a backup, obviously. And yeah, work in batches, start with the easy ones and then walk your way through the environments, right? Don't be scared off by the number. If you have 1,000 databases to migrate, right? It will work. In the end, you will have scripts to do it, most of the work automatically, but you need to start somewhere, right? Create the scripts and optimize them one by one. You will see other issues popping up and that you need to account for. For sure, make sure that you have an actual plan how you do this, right? Also a chance to get rid of existing unused databases, logins, users, or even whole servers that you will find out are actually not used anymore. That happens a lot, right? So even if you end up out of 1,000 servers, you may end up just migrating 900 because you realize 100 are not used anymore, will be replaced with newer versions, etc. Right? That happens a lot. Here's a question that I have been waiting for. What about stacking instances? Kai Michael Price is asking, right? Instances, yeah. Let me just read through it here. Okay, so the gist of the question, I understand all these, the reasons why you may separate out instances, right? The gist of the question that has been asked is basically, what about using instances instead of dedicated servers? Is that correct, Kai, Michael? Yeah, right. That's the gist of it, right? So, yeah, I do not recommend using named instances. Absolutely not. There's a few reasons, but the main reason is just it will make your life harder in terms of tooling, support that you will need, in terms of managing that server with multiple installations on the same bed, on the same host, on the same VM, right? It's not obviously the same host, but the same VM, multiple SQL Server installations. It is gonna be messy. I can guarantee you that. All right. Some tools don't even work properly with that. I'm talking about like performance monitoring, or applications, right? So I would definitely not recommend using instances, and that's why I have not mentioned them ever, right? If I talk about dedicated target systems, I always talk about a separate system altogether, like a dedicated VM, right? And if you have a license for the whole host anyway, if you remember the licensing slide where I licensed Enterprise Edition for the whole host, right? VMware host, then it doesn't matter how many VMs you run there, right? It doesn't help you to save anything if you use a named instance, right? No, just run a VM, right? That makes it cleaner, right? You can isolate it completely for security. Also, the host itself is a target, right? So just don't get into that slight differentiation between a named instance and another one, right? If somebody can take over your named instances, there is a chance that you may even jump from one instance to the other one, right? Now it really comes down to your security settings, right? Obviously you can prevent it if you do things right, but you may not, right? Or somebody else may not. So no. All right. Yeah. Yeah, I hope that answers this. Yeah. So this is just an example how we, that's a Python quality lab, go ahead, right? A plan, right? Have a plan, an Excel sheet, etc. Make sure that you follow your agreed upon steps, right? Assessment tasks, pre-mitigation tasks, preparation tasks, and then the actual migration, etc. So that just gives you maybe an idea here how that can look like. It doesn't have to be that formal, right? It depends on you, right? If you do more of these, the bigger you do such things, you will want to have something similar. Right. All right, yeah, feel free to ask questions in the chat, maybe even per voice. If it's not too many, I can handle that. I did mention one tool which I used for these hardware evaluations, and I had a screenshot inside for the jobs, for example. So I am actually using this one here quite a lot for my consolidation projects. And the advantage why I'm using this one is that this tool actually understands how to consolidate hardware requirements. So it understands hardware utilization and how to basically stack it onto one or multiple servers, right? To take the sum of the actual usage data, not just the sum. It's a bit smarter than that, and give you recommendations of how large your target installations needs to be in Azure or on premises, and you can calculate it back and forth and tune it, right? So that helps me a lot in these consolidation projects, because you need a tool that tells you how many CPUs, how much RAM do you actually need in your target installation, right? You don't want to calculate everything by hand. You don't want to collect performance counters from 100 servers or more, right? So some tool I would recommend, that's the one I'm using. If you want any help with that, get in touch with me. I can help you probably with some discount there. Yeah, that's the only ad I have here. Jumping back to myself. Yeah. Any more questions? Let me know. Sure. You're welcome, Ralph. Hi, Michael, sorry. Yeah, I will talk to Ralph later, actually.
Well, Andreas, this has been great. I got to tell you, while everybody's thinking of their questions, and I'm sure somebody has one, at least as we finish up, I want to remind everyone that we have another presentation coming next week, April 15th, called Microsoft Fabric as an Enterprise Data Platform by Tim Kirchke. So that one should be fun. As we have all heard so much stuff about Microsoft Fabric, so reasons to actually start using it. That is great. Yeah. So with that, if there are no more questions, then Andreas, I do appreciate everything you've done, brought forth and talked about here. It's been wonderful.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Evelyn, as I said earlier in the presentation, they will be posted onto our YouTube page, hopefully within the next week or so. So if there are no more questions, thanks everyone. Have a great day, and we will talk at y'all soon.